One thing that's holding it back is that people don't know quite how to monetize it. So you look at the big courses like Coursera and Udacity, they're not making a lot of money. But it's worth remembering that the internet didn't make much money when it started. People couldn't figure out how to make money from the internet. They couldn't work out how Facebook would ever make any money. Well, they figured that out. Google didn't have a business model. They just had a search engine. So I think where there's a demand, there's a market. And I should think over time, this is going to be one of the great transformations. And by the way, if it transforms higher education, schools will change as a consequence, because what keeps schools where they are is this keystone that's locked in at the top of the arch of education, which is getting to college. That's the thing that keeps the system where it is. And that's what drives the testing industry, the SATs, all that stuff. It's getting to college. And if suddenly getting to college isn't the holy grail, if it's suddenly not everybody's ambition, if it's suddenly not worth it in the same way, if there's a cheaper, better, more effective way to do it, if there's an iTunes available, it could be a major disruption. I mean, nothing's certain, but I think it could be a big disruption. And I think if it brings mass education to people at a better cost, then I wouldn't see a case against it.
Do you think maybe the idea of a classroom is something that's outdated?
I don't know myself. I mean, I think that there's something that you get from being in the room with people that you don't get from being online yet. Don't you agree?
I just wonder if technology is going to replace the teacher in the kind of, it could almost become like a one-on-one, almost like a tutor,
But there's a lot. The difficulty with this is you don't quite know where this technology is going to take us. That's the truth of it. I mean, it's worth remembering that in 2007 there weren't any iPhones, and there were no iPads, until a couple of years ago. And now people don't know what they did before. The iPhone came out in 2007. When it came out, there were 800 apps for the iPhone. There are now 800,000 apps for the iPhone. I mean, that just has taken off like a rocket. Google is now working on this thing called Google Glass. Have you seen that? Where people wear a computer embedded into a pair of spectacles. I think it's a terrible idea myself. It really, But I saw Sergey Brin demonstrating this at the TED conference, and I was just amused by it. I mean, he's a brilliant guy, but he was there explaining how much of a drag it is to have to get a phone out your pocket. you know what that's like. I mean, all that fingering thing. What is that? You have to get it out, then you have to go on the screen and stretch stuff out. Honestly, how we cope with it. Whereas these things, you can wear these glasses and you can operate it with your eyes. So he said, I could be meeting somebody for the first time, and while I'm talking to them, I can flip my eyes and go into their Facebook page. I thought, this is just weird, isn't it? This needs to be stopped. I mean, the idea that you're chatting to them for the first time, and they're online checking you out.
Yeah.
I mean, there are more benign uses for it, but the thing is, to operate it, the screen comes about here in front of your face, apparently. So if we're both wearing these glasses, we're not looking at each other. Our focal length is about here, as I'm trying to work out whether it's worth carrying on this conversation with you. Anyway, these wearable devices are going to come.
Yeah.
But the step beyond that is what Ray Kurzweil and others call the singularity, which is where we'll merge with computers and information systems. That's already happening. There are already interfaces that don't require any physical contact whatever. They're just with the power of thought. And as nanotechnology converges with genetics, it's perfectly feasible in the near future that we'll have device implanted into our brains and other parts of our body.
It just seems to me that having 30 kids and then a teacher standing at the front of a classroom was born out of necessity of, you couldn't have 30 teachers teaching 30 kids, whereas technology allows...
Well, I think that just two things about it. I mean, one is we don't know how the technology will play out, really, of course. I mean, if you'd said in the 17th century, I mean, how do you feel about flying to New York? People wouldn't have any way of even starting the conversation with you, what are you talking about? I mean, Isaac Newton apparently worked out the physics of the escape velocity from the Earth's atmosphere to get to the moon. They figured out how to do that. In fact, the Apollo missions used the equations that he developed for the amount of thrust that was needed to get off the Earth's surface and break through gravity to get to the moon. The trouble is, when he was writing, the most powerful engines around were horses. and wagons, and it would have taken an awful lot of horses to escape the Earth's velocity at that point. And it's very hard to anticipate a paradigm created by a technology that's not been invented yet. We just don't know. But as things stand, I'm just saying, I think there's a lot you get a lot from being in a room with people at the moment that you don't get by even the best sort of FaceTime or Skype. Mm-hmm. You know that. Mm-hmm. And a lot of learning happens best collaboratively. And there are all kinds of ways in which the technologies will help us. But there are all sorts of ways you learn that aren't helped by these things. I mean, like if you're doing theatre together or dance, or a lot of arts practices where you need to put all that stuff down and do it differently. Mm-hmm. But you are right. The model of one teacher in front of 30 kids was never a terribly good idea, actually. I mean, the best teachers never sat in front of 30 kids all day long anyway. They had them up and around and doing things. And the job of a teacher, properly conceived, is a facilitator, an enabler, a kind of somebody mentors and curates and provokes. And there's a big shift in higher education now along those lines, that rather than having a lecturer stand at the front talking for 2 hours, Harvard is now, this guy Eric Mazur, who's a physics professor there, read an article a few years ago about how even the most successful of his students, or physics students in the Ivy League universities, don't really understand the practical implications of many of the theoretical concepts. And he thought, well, that can't be true. It can't be true of my students. So he got his top class together and he gave them some real-world examples of things like force and energy, and they didn't have a clue. They'd passed the exam. They didn't know how it worked. He said, if a truck this size hits a truck that size, what happens? And they didn't know. So he got half the class who did seem to understand it to explain the ones who didn't. And now, he said, and they got it in a heartbeat. So now, instead of lecturing to them, he gives them the lectures on tape, they watch it in their own time, but when they get to the class, they do group work. And he said the effect on their understanding of the ideas and the levels of engagement in the class are off the charts, because previously they were sitting at the back of his class on Facebook, while he was lecturing away at them. And I'll catch up with this later on. Well, it just interests me, that we now have Harvard embracing what good kindergarten teachers have known for years, which is get people on their feet and get them learning together. So I don't see an end to learning communities. In fact, the most successful online university has been around since the 1970s. It's the Open University in England. It's got the biggest enrollment of any university anywhere. And my daughter's enrolled in it right now. And they've always had, it starts out as television, but it's now online. But they always have live tutorials and seminars. My daughter's going to one this weekend in Camden. Because people need it. You just need to be in the room and feel people's energy. So I don't see an end to it, but I think it'll certainly change everything.